The morning they auctioned off Orville Bristol's entire life, not a single soul in Dusty Creek, Colorado showed up to bid, except for one woman standing at the back of the crowd with a worn leather satchel and a quiet kind of determination that most men in town had long since mistaken for stubbornness. It was the autumn of 1882, and the western frontier still carried its teeth. The mountains that ringed Dusty Creek stood purple and indifferent against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at directly, and the wind that swept down through the canyon smelled of pine resin and the promise of an early snow. The town itself was not much to look at: a main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Copper Bit, a church that leaned slightly to the east as though it had been listening too long to the sinners inside it, and about 40 scattered homes that ranged from proper painted clapboard to rough-hewn dugout sod. It was the kind of place people passed through on their way somewhere else, or the kind of place they stopped and never quite managed to leave, which amounted to nearly the same thing in the end. Letitia Fletcher had lived in Dusty Creek for 6 years, and in those 6 years she had built herself something that the town had not quite expected from a woman who had arrived alone with 2 trunks and a milk cow. She ran a small boarding house on the eastern edge of town, a 2-story structure with 4 guest rooms, a kitchen that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and roasting meat, and a front porch wide enough to hold 6 rocking chairs, all of which were occupied on warm evenings by the miners and cattlemen and passing travelers who paid $2 a week for a clean bed and 3 meals a day. She was 31 years old. With dark auburn hair she wore pinned up beneath a practical straw hat, and brown eyes that had a way of seeing through the particular brand of nonsense that frontier men tended to perform for one another. She was not beautiful in the way that saloon paintings were beautiful, but she was striking in a way that lasted longer, the kind of face you remembered a week after you'd seen it because something in her expression suggested she understood considerably more than she had let on. She had heard about the Bristol foreclosure from her boarder, a retired land surveyor named Mr. Pratt, who had heard it from the county clerk, who had posted the notice on the door of the general store the previous Tuesday. The Bristol Ranch, 40 acres of good pasture land along Willow Creek, a solid barn, a modest but well-built house, 6 horses, a herd of 20 cattle, and all the tools and furnishings therein, was to be auctioned to satisfy a debt held by the Territorial Bank of Colorado Springs. The debt was $480, accumulated across 2 bad drought years and a cattle illness that had taken 11 of Orville Bristol's best animals the previous spring. Letitia had never met Orville Bristol. She knew of him the way everyone in a small frontier town knew of everyone else, loosely, through fragments of second-hand information. He was said to be somewhere around 35, a former Army scout who had mustered out after the campaigns wound down and tried his hand at ranching. He was quiet, people said, kept to himself, paid his debts when he could, drank occasionally at the Copper Bit but never caused trouble. His wife had died 3 years prior of fever, leaving him with a young daughter named Clara who was now 7 years old, and he had been raising the girl alone while trying to keep the ranch from slipping out from under him. By all accounts, he had very nearly managed it. And then the second drought had come, and the bank had called the note. Letitia had thought about it for 3 days before she made her decision, turning the matter over in the quiet hours after her guests had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her ledger book and a cup of tea. She had saved carefully over 6 years. She was not wealthy by any reasonable measure, but she was solvent in a way that felt almost unusual for a woman running a single establishment in a small frontier town, and that solvency was the result of nothing more or less than tireless work and an almost aggressive refusal to spend money she did not have. $480 would not ruin her. It would empty a portion of the savings she had been setting aside for expanding the boarding house, but it would not ruin her. And something about the situation, A man losing 40 acres of good land and a well-built house and his daughter's home, all because 2 bad years and a cattle illness had conspired against him at once, sat in her chest like a stone that she could not ignore. She was not a woman given to impulsive sentiment. She had learned early in her life that sentiment without strategy was just a different kind of recklessness. But she had also learned, and this was perhaps the harder lesson, that there were moments when the right thing and the practical thing aligned if you were willing to look carefully enough, and this felt like one of those moments. The land along Willow Creek was good land. She had heard people say so. She had no particular use for 40 acres of pasture, but she was practical enough to know that land did not lose its value simply because she could not immediately identify its purpose. She told herself it was an investment. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. On the morning of the auction, the 14th of October, 1882, Letitia, dressed in her dark green wool dress, pinned her hair, placed her straw hat on her head, and walked the 3 blocks to the steps of the county clerk's office where the auction was to be held. The crowd that had gathered, she counted 12 men standing in loose clusters, was there in the way that frontier men attended things they found mildly interesting but not interesting enough to participate in. They watched with their thumbs hooked in their belt loops and their hats pushed back on their foreheads, and none of them raised a hand when the county clerk, a wiry little man named Dobbs who always looked faintly apologetic about whatever he was doing, called the auction to order. Orville Bristol was not present. Letitia had thought he might be there, that he might stand and watch his life sold off in the October sun, but he was not, and she felt the absence of him like a particular kind of sadness she could not quite name. Dobbs called for opening bids at the assessed value. Silence. The men in the crowd shuffled and exchanged glances. Dobbs lowered the opening to 300. More silence. Someone coughed. Letitia waited a full 10 seconds, during which the October wind moved through the street and sent a single yellowed cottonwood leaf skittering across the wooden steps, and then she raised her hand and said, quietly but clearly, $480. Dobbs blinked at her. The crowd turned. Several of the men looked genuinely startled, as though a chair had suddenly spoken. $480, she repeated, and her voice was perfectly level. Dobbs, to his credit, recovered quickly. He asked 3 times for other bids, and when none materialized, he brought his gavel down with a sound like a small crack of thunder, and announced that the Bristol property had been sold to Miss Letitia Fletcher for the sum of $480, sufficient to satisfy the outstanding debt in full. She signed the papers. She paid from the satchel. She walked home. She had no plan beyond that. She put the deed in the strongbox beneath her bed and went to start dinner for her boarders, and she told herself she would figure out the rest of it in time. She did not expect Orville Bristol to appear on her front porch 4 days later. She was hanging washing on the line behind the boarding house on a cold and brilliantly clear Thursday morning, when she heard boots on the front steps and then a knock at the door. And when she came around the corner of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, she stopped still, because the man standing at her front door was not anyone she recognized, and she made it her business to know most people in Dusty Creek. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from years of physical labor rather than any particular vanity about it. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn canvas coat, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him with a kind of careful formality that struck her immediately as deeply earnest. His hair was dark and touched with early gray at the temples, and his face was weathered and angular, not handsome in any conventional sense, but interesting in the way that faces were interesting when they had lived through things and come out the other side still intact. He had dark eyes under heavy brows, and those eyes, when they found her coming around the corner of the house, held an expression she recognized because she had felt it before herself, the particular combination of gratitude and discomfort that came from owing someone something you had not asked for and could not yet repay. He was approximately 35 or 36, she judged, and he looked like a man who had not slept particularly well in some number of weeks. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "I am," she said, stopping a few feet away from him and studying his face with the directness that people in Dusty Creek had long since stopped being surprised by. "My name is Orville Bristol," he said. "I believe you bought my property at the county auction on Monday." "I did," she said. He turned his hat in his hands and seemed to be arranging words with some care. "I came to thank you," he said. "I know that might seem strange. You paid the bank's price fair and square, and that's entirely your right, and I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But my daughter and I were still on the property when the auction happened because I didn't have anywhere else to take her yet, and I want you to know we'll be cleared out by the end of the week. I have a friend in Pueblo who says he can put me on at his cattle operation for the winter, and we'll make arrangements from there." He delivered this speech with the careful dignity of a man who had been practicing it, and Letitia listened to it all the way through without interrupting him, which was her habit when someone was saying something that mattered to them. Then she said, "Orville Bristol, I did not buy your property to turn you out of it." He blinked. The wind moved between them, and somewhere down the street, a wagon rattled past on the frozen ruts of the road. "I'm sorry," he said. "I bought it because no one else was going to," she said. "And it seemed to me like a terrible shame to let good land and a good house go to nothing because of 2 bad drought years. I've been thinking about what to do with it since Monday, and I've arrived at a proposal if you're willing to hear it." He stared at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he said, "I'm listening." "Come inside," she said. "I've got coffee on, and it's cold enough out here that I can see my breath, which means this is a conversation better had indoors." He followed her inside, ducking slightly under the doorframe out of habit, and she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set them on the kitchen table and sat down across from him. He sat with his hat in his lap and his hands wrapped around the cup, and she noticed that his hands were the hands of a man who worked hard, scarred and calloused, and marked with the small specific injuries of ranch labor. She laid it out plainly. She held the deed, which meant she held the legal claim to the property. She was not inclined to simply give it back, because she had no mechanism for guaranteeing that the bank would not simply pursue him again before he could recover his footing, and she had not paid $480 to hand it directly back to the possibility of another foreclosure. But she was also not inclined to turn a family off their land. Her proposal was this: he would continue to work the ranch, and a portion of whatever profit the cattle operation generated. She said 1/3, which she had calculated as the amount that would allow him to rebuild his finances and eventually buy the property back from her, would come to her as a kind of lease payment. When he had saved enough to repay the $480 in full, she would sign the deed back to him, and the whole arrangement would conclude. She was not asking for anything beyond the money she had put out, plus a small consideration for the time value of the loan. She had written the numbers down on a piece of paper, and she pushed it across the table to him. He studied the paper for a long time. She could see the muscles working in his jaw. "Why?" he said at last, looking up at her. "Because it's the practical thing," she said. "For who?" he said. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "For both of us," she said, and she met his eyes steadily. "I have no use for a cattle ranch, you clearly do. And I have invested money that I would prefer to have returned to me in a reasonable period of time, rather than have it sit in a piece of land I don't know what to do with." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could have sold the land for considerably more than $480 once the drought broke. Everyone in the county knows that pasture along Willow Creek runs green most years." "Yes," she said. "So this is not strictly the most profitable arrangement for you," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted into something more complicated than gratitude, something searching and direct, and she thought quite honest. "I'll take the arrangement," he said. "And I want you to know, Miss Fletcher, that I will honor every term of it. You have my word on that, and my word is the only currency I currently have in any abundance." "That's all I'm asking for," she said. He finished his coffee, thanked her again, put his hat back on his head, and left. She watched him walk down the porch steps and along the street toward the livery where she supposed his horse was tied, and she noticed that he walked with a slight stiffness in his left leg that she had not observed when he arrived, probably because he had been standing still, the kind of old injury that only made itself known in motion. She went back to her washing and told herself that she had done a sensible thing, and that the warmth in her chest when she had seen the relief in his eyes was simply the satisfaction of a practical problem well solved. She was not entirely persuasive, even to herself. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Letitia had not anticipated. Orville brought her the first monthly payment at the beginning of November, $14 and some cents, representing a third of the modest profit from selling 2 steers in Pueblo, and he presented it in a sealed envelope with a handwritten accounting inside that was precise to the penny, and written in a clear, careful hand that surprised her. She had not expected the accounting, and she told him so. "My mother was a school teacher in Ohio," he said, standing on her porch in the cold November morning light. "She insisted on arithmetic. Said it was the only honest language." "She was right," Letitia said. "She was right about most things," he said, and there was something quiet and fond in the way he said it that made her understand without further explanation that his mother was no longer living. After that, he came on the first of each month with his envelope and his accounting, and after the first 2 or 3 visits, she began to put the coffee pot on when she saw him riding down the main street because she knew he would stop, and he always did, and they would sit in the kitchen for an hour or more talking about the ranch, about the cattle, about the weather and its effects on the pasture and the prospects for the next year. He was not a man who talked a great deal in general, she gathered, but he talked with her in a way that was unhurried and genuinely engaged, and she found herself looking forward to the first of each month with an anticipation she attempted to keep in proportion. She met Clara Bristol in November as well, when Orville brought her to the general store one afternoon, and Letitia happened to be there picking up a bolt of flannel. Clara was a serious, dark-eyed little girl who looked remarkably like her father, with the same angular features softened into something rounder and more childlike, and who regarded Letitia with the frank and thorough assessment of a child who had learned to evaluate adults with some care. After approximately 2 minutes of this evaluation, she announced that she liked Letitia's hat and asked if she had always worn green. "Not always," Letitia said, crouching down to Clara's level. "When I was about your age, I was very fond of a yellow dress my mother made me, but then I grew up and discovered that green suits me better." Clara thought about this seriously. "I think I will wear blue when I am grown," she said. "It matches the creek." "That's a very good reason," Letitia said. Clara seemed satisfied with this exchange and went back to examining the candy jars on the counter. Orville, standing behind her, caught Letitia's eye with an expression that was warm and a little unguarded, the expression of a man watching his child be treated with simple courtesy, and feeling it more than he would perhaps have liked to show. December arrived with snow, and the mountains disappeared behind a wall of gray and white that descended to the valley floor and turned the world soft and muffled. Letitia's boarding house was full 4 miners riding out the winter rather than working in dangerous weather, a cattle buyer from Denver who was visiting family in the area, and a young couple newly arrived from Kansas who were trying to establish themselves and had nowhere yet to go. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cooking, and in the evenings the boarders gathered in the front room and someone usually played the harmonica or told stories, and Letitia sat at her mending and listened and felt, on most evenings, that she had built something reasonable and good. On the 20th of December, Orville appeared at her door in the early evening, not the first of the month, which was unusual, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders and the particular way he held himself that something had happened. She brought him inside and got him seated and got the coffee poured before she asked him what was wrong. "I need to tell you something about the ranch," he said, and I want to tell you honestly before it becomes something you hear from someone else." "Go ahead," she said. He had been approached, he explained, by a man named Harlan Goss, who ran a substantial cattle operation north of Dusty Creek and who had been making acquisitions of smaller ranches throughout the county over the past 18 months. Goss had found out, through the county records, presumably, or through the particular information networks of small frontier towns, that Letitia held the deed to the Bristol property, and Goss had made an offer. He had come directly to Orville first, apparently operating on the assumption that Orville might serve as an intermediary or might have influence over the decision. He had offered $600 for the property, which was a premium over what Letitia had paid. "He'll come to you directly next," Orville said. "I wanted you to hear it from me first, and I wanted to say that whatever you decide, I understand. You'd be turning a profit on your investment and you would have every right to take it." "And what would happen to you and Clara?" she asked. He met her eyes directly. "We'd manage," he said, which was not an answer exactly, but she understood it for what it was: pride and honesty combined into something that refused to ask her for anything beyond what she had already agreed to. "Tell me about Harlan Goss," she said. He told her. Goss was not a man of good reputation in the detailed, specific way that mattered on the frontier. Not a criminal, not violent, but the kind of man who accumulated property through means that were legal and still managed to be ruthless, who had dispossessed 3 or 4 families in the county over the past 2 years through the ordinary mechanics of debt and legal pressure. The small ranchers he had bought out had not fared especially well afterward. 2 had left the territory entirely. Letitia drank her coffee and thought. "I'm not selling to Harlan Goss," she said. Orville looked at her steadily. "Miss Fletcher." "No," she said, and her voice had a flatness that was not unkind but was entirely final. "The purpose of that arrangement was to keep you and Clara on that property and give you a chance to get back on your feet. Selling to Goss would defeat the purpose. I didn't invest $480 in this situation to end up as an instrument of someone else's land accumulation." He was quiet for a moment, and the fire crackled in the stove between them, and outside the December snow fell in long soft curtains against the windows. Then he said, "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Fletcher." She felt color rise in her face, which she found irritating, and she kept her expression neutral with a discipline that had served her well on many occasions. "I'm a practical woman," she said. "They are not always the same thing, but in this case they happen to align." The corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was pointed in that direction. It was the first time she had seen anything like a smile on his face, and it did something entirely unreasonable to her composure. "Would you and Clara like to come to the boarding house for Christmas dinner?" she asked, because she needed to change the direction of the conversation, and also because the question had been forming in her mind for several weeks, and she had been waiting for a sufficiently practical justification for asking it. "I always cook a large dinner, and there is generally more than the boarders can eat." He accepted with a gravity that suggested the invitation meant considerably more to him than he was prepared to say. Christmas dinner was a production. Letitia cooked for 2 days beforehand roasted chicken and salt pork and sweet potatoes and dried apple pie and corn bread, and she set the long kitchen table with the good tablecloth she kept in the cedar chest and brought out the china plates that had come west with her in one of the 2 trunks. The boarders were present, and several of them had brought contributions. The cattle buyer from Denver produced a bottle of good bourbon that he said was too fine to drink alone, and the young couple from Kansas, whose names were the Harrises, brought a plate of molasses cookies that the wife had baked that morning. Orville and Clara arrived at noon. Clara was wearing a blue dress and had her hair in 2 neat braids, and she was carrying, very carefully in both arms, a small pine bough she had decorated with bits of ribbon and dried flowers. She presented it to Letitia at the door with the formality of a small diplomat presenting credentials. "It is for your house," Clara said. Papa helped me tie the ribbons. It is the most beautiful pine bough I have ever seen, Letitia said truthfully, because it was, and because the look on Clara's face when she said it was worth every word. Orville shook hands with the boarders and accepted a small glass of the cattle buyer's bourbon with the careful pleasure of a man who did not often have occasion for such things. And he sat at the table with a quietness that was comfortable rather than withdrawn, answering questions when asked and listening attentively the rest of the time. And Letitia, moving between kitchen and table with the efficiency of a woman who had managed domestic production at scale for years, found herself glancing at him more often than was strictly necessary. At one point she came out of the kitchen with the pie and found him in conversation with old Mr. Pratt about the geography of the Willow Creek Valley, and he caught her eye over Mr. Pratt's head and the expression on his face present, warm, entirely unguarded in a way she had not seen before, stopped her mid-step for just a moment before she recovered herself and set the pie on the table. After dinner, when the boarders had drifted to the front room and Clara had fallen asleep on the settee with her blue dress spread around her like a small lake, Letitia and Orville stood on the back porch in the cold December evening, both of them holding mugs of coffee, looking out at the snow-covered yard and the dark shapes of the mountains beyond the town. "Thank you," he said, "for today." "All of it? It was a good dinner," she said. "Miss Fletcher," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him directly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that if you find the question inappropriate I will understand entirely and we need not speak of it again." Her heart was doing something unhelpful inside her chest. "Ask it," she said. "Would you do me the honor of walking with me sometime?" he said. "Not today and not on business, just walking, if you were willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very bright above the mountains, and the cold air smelled of wood smoke and pine and the particular clean emptiness of winter at high altitude, and Orville Bristol was standing beside her with an expression of careful hope that was, she thought, one of the most honest things she had ever seen on a man's face. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." They began walking in January, when the snow permitted it, along the creek road south of town, and these walks became the fixed point around which the rest of the week organized itself. He would come on Sunday afternoons after Clara was settled with a book or with the Harris children next door, and they would walk for an hour or sometimes two, and they talked, actually talked, in the way that she had not talked with anyone in some years, with the particular freedom that came from the specific combination of honesty and trust that she had observed in him from their very first conversation, and that she was increasingly aware, been starved for. He told her about the Army years, the scouting work in the late 1870s, the campaigns that were already winding down by the time he was involved, the long stretches across difficult terrain, and the particular loneliness of that kind of work. He spoke carefully and without glorification about the injustices he had witnessed in those years, the displacement, the broken agreements, the treatment of people whose land this had been long before any settler or soldier arrived. He was not sentimental about his own role in it, which she respected. He had been a young man doing work he was paid to do, and the fact that he looked back on it with clear eyes rather than comfortable revisionism told her something important about his character. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up the daughter of a carpenter and a schoolteacher, and about the early marriage she did not speak of often, a man she had wed at 22 who had died of a mining accident in Nevada 2 years after they came west, leaving her with very little beyond the boarding house she had built with the small inheritance her mother had left her, and the skills her own capable parents had made sure she had. She had grieved him and then she had worked, because working was the thing she knew how to do, and the boarding house had grown out of that combination of grief and purpose in a way that she had never quite been able to separate. He listened to all of this with the same steady, attentive quality he brought to everything, and when she finished he said, "You built all of this yourself." "With help," she said fairly. "Mr. Pratt helped me with the legal paperwork in the early years." The Navarro family on Mesa Street helped me with the construction. Nothing is built entirely alone. No, he said, but the foundation was yours. She had not thought about it in precisely those terms before, and finding that he had stated it that way, plainly, without embellishment, simply as a fact he had observed, did something to the interior of her chest that she was gradually becoming less inclined to categorize as mere practicality. February was cold and the walks were shorter, but they continued. One Sunday in February, it began to snow partway through their walk, and they sheltered under the broad overhang of a cottonwood tree at the bend of the creek, standing close together in the necessity of the shared space. And the snow fell around them in absolute silence, and Letitia was aware, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its precision, of the warmth of him standing beside her, and the way his arm had come up with entirely unconscious protectiveness to partially shelter her from the wind. She did not step away, neither did he. They stood beneath the cottonwood and watched the snow fall on the frozen creek, and after a while he said, quietly, as though speaking too loudly might break something, "I have not felt this easy with another person in a very long time." "Nor have I," she said. The snow continued to fall. The creek made its small, cold sounds beneath the ice. After another moment he turned his head and looked at her, and she turned hers and looked at him, and the space between them seemed to have contracted of its own accord, until she could see the particular texture of the gray at his temples and the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, and she thought with absolute clarity, "I am entirely in trouble here." Then Clara's voice came calling from somewhere down the road, having escaped from the Harris children and apparently tracked them by their footprints in the snow, and the moment resolved itself without crisis into a small girl covered in snowflakes demanding to know why they were standing under a tree. And the spell, if it had been a spell, dissolved into something that was different but possibly warmer. March brought the first signs of thaw, and with it Harlan Goss in person. Letitia was in the general store when Goss appeared, a heavy-set man with a good suit and the kind of smooth, practiced friendliness that she recognized as the social front of someone who had learned to put people at ease for strategic rather than genuine reasons. He introduced himself pleasantly and said he understood she was holding the deed to the Bristol property and that he had made an inquiry some months prior that had not been answered. "I chose not to answer it," she said, selecting a spool of thread with her attention nominally on the thread rather than on him, which she knew he found mildly infuriating and which she intended. "It was a good offer," he said. "It was," she agreed. "I'm still not interested." He shifted his approach, as she had expected he would. Was she aware, he asked, of the difficulties that a single woman holding rural property was likely to encounter? Were there not expenses and liabilities associated with ranch land that were rather onerous for someone in her position? Would it not be simpler, from a practical standpoint, to liquidate the asset and redirect the capital toward her existing business? She put down the thread and turned to look at him directly, which was a thing she did when she wanted someone's full attention and invariably received it. "Mr. Goss," she said pleasantly, "I am a practical woman and I appreciate a practical argument. But I am not going to sell that property to you. Not now, and not if you come back in the spring, and not if you send someone on your behalf in the summer. The ranch is serving its current purpose, which is none of your business, and that purpose is not going to change because you find my reluctance inconvenient. Good day." She picked up her thread, paid for it at the counter, and left the store. She did not look back to see his expression, though she imagined it was not especially pleased. She told Orville about it on their next walk, on a Sunday when the snow was retreating from the lower meadows, and the first pale suggestions of green were appearing at the edges of the creek banks. He listened with the controlled quality of a man keeping his reaction deliberate. When she had finished, he said, "I don't like that he approached you directly." "He was very civil," she said. "He is always civil," Orville said. "That's what makes him effective." He paused and then said, quietly but seriously, "Are you certain you don't want to reconsider? I mean that honestly, Letitia. I don't want this arrangement to become a burden for you." It was the first time he had used her first name rather than Miss Fletcher, and she was almost certain he had not entirely noticed he had done it. "I am quite certain," she said. He nodded slowly and they walked on, and she noticed after a while that his hand, swinging at his side as they walked, was very close to hers, and she noticed also that she did not increase the space between them. Spring arrived properly in April, and with it, a development that neither of them had anticipated. One of Orville's mares produced twin foals, a rare event, and he sent word to Letitia through the general store because he thought she might like to see them. And she walked the 2 miles out to the Bristol ranch on a warm April afternoon to find him standing in the barn doorway with an expression of uncomplicated delight that she had not yet seen on his face, and that transformed his features in a way she found herself storing somewhere private inside herself. The foals were small and impossibly leggy, wobbling together in the straw while their mother watched them with the particular exhausted patience of new motherhood, and Letitia crouched down at the edge of the stall and watched them for a long time while Orville stood beside her, and Clara sat in the straw with her blue dress pulled up around her knees and narrated her opinions on the foals' respective characters. "That one is the serious one," Clara announced, pointing to the slightly larger foal. "He will be for working. And that one is the silly one. He is for adventures." "How can you tell?" Orville asked his daughter with a gravity that was mostly genuine. "By their ears," Clara said simply, and returned to her straw. Letitia looked up at Orville and he looked down at her, and they both smiled at the same moment, not politely, not carefully, but with the unguarded simultaneity of people who had arrived at the same feeling from the same direction at the same time, and the warmth of it spread through her like the April sun on the barn boards behind her. She stayed for supper that evening for the first time, a simple meal of beans and corn bread that Orville made with the efficient competence of a man long accustomed to cooking for himself and his daughter, and Clara ate her supper and fell asleep at the table, and Letitia helped carry her to bed while Orville banked the kitchen fire. And when she came back to the kitchen, he was standing at the table looking at her with an expression that was no longer casual or incidental or carefully maintained. "Letitia," he said, and his voice had a quietness that was different from his usual quietness, lower, more careful. "Yes," she said, not as an answer to anything specific but as an acknowledgement that she understood where the conversation was going and was not going to pretend otherwise. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and stood very close to her and looked at her with the same searching honesty that she had first observed in his face on her front porch back in October, and now at close range she could see everything in it, the uncertainty, the care, the particular specific gravity of a man who did not do anything lightly and was not doing this lightly. "I would very much like to know if you have feelings for me," he said. "Because I have them for you, and they are considerable, and I would rather know the truth of your situation than spend another 3 months trying to determine it by observation." She laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, partly at the precise and earnest construction of the sentence and partly at the relief of hearing it said out loud, and she saw his expression shift from apprehension to something very like hope, and she said, "Orville Bristol, I have had feelings for you since approximately January, and I have been telling myself it was the coffee that made our Sundays something I looked forward to." Smile that came to his face at that, the real, full, unguarded smile she had been catching glimpses of for months was, she thought, one of the finest things she had seen in a long time. He took her hand with a formality that was entirely characteristic of him and entirely endearing, and they stood in the lamplight of his kitchen while the April wind moved outside and the fire settled in the stove, and she thought that this felt, more than almost anything else in her adult life, like a place she was supposed to be. He kissed her hand with a quiet gravity that was so genuine it made her chest ache, and she thought about how 6 months ago she had been a woman in a kitchen working her ledger book, and this man had been a name on a foreclosure notice, and life had a way of routing itself through the most unexpected geography. May came on warm and bright, and the Willow Creek pasture turned the deep spring green that everyone had always said it would, and Orville's cattle were fat and healthy after the winter, and the two foals were growing at a rate that Clara found deeply satisfying. The Bristol Ranch felt, to anyone who visited it in May of 1883, like a place that had found its footing again. Letitia visited twice a week now, and the visits were no longer conducted with any pretense of being purely about business. She brought Clara books from the general store's small lending shelf, and taught her the card games her own mother had taught her, and she and Orville sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the evenings, while the light went golden, and talked about everything, and nothing, with the ease of two people who had decided to stop rationing their enjoyment of each other's company. The boarding house continued to operate efficiently. Mr. Pratt, who was now 70 and sharp as ever, had observed the development with the pleased satisfaction of a man who felt he had contributed to it, on the grounds that his mention of the foreclosure had started the whole chain of events. The Harrises had established themselves in a house of their own on the north end of town, but still came to dinner on Sundays out of habit and affection. On a warm evening in early June, when the mountains were showing the last of their snow only at the highest elevations, and the meadows were full of wildflowers, Letitia came back from an afternoon at the ranch to find a telegram waiting for her at the telegraph office. An unusual occurrence, since her family in Ohio was limited to a distant cousin in Columbus who communicated by letter. The telegram was from a law office in Denver and contained news that required her to read it twice before she fully absorbed it. Her late husband's mining claim in Nevada, the one she had long since written off as worthless after his death, the one that had been tied up in a legal dispute between the mining company and several claimants for the better part of a decade, had been resolved. Her share of the settlement was $240, which the Denver law office had been holding in trust and which was now available to her upon her presentation of proper identification. She stood on the boardwalk outside the telegraph office and read the telegram a third time, and then sat down on the nearby bench and laughed, until she had to take her hat off and fan herself, because the timing of it arriving now, of all times, just as the financial arrangement that had started this entire course of events was beginning to accelerate toward its conclusion, was the kind of thing that felt less like coincidence and more like the universe making a particular editorial comment. She wrote back to the Denver law office that afternoon and arranged for the funds to be forwarded by bank draft. When she told Orville about it on Sunday, he listened with his characteristic attention and then sat quiet for a moment before he said, "That's a remarkable coincidence." "Isn't it?" she agreed. He was looking at the creek, which was bright and quick in the June sun, and she could see him thinking about something with the deliberate care he brought to things that mattered. Then he said, without turning his head, "Letitia, I want to ask you something important." "Go ahead," she said, as she had said to him before. He turned then and looked at her with the full gravity of his attention, and she felt the significance of the moment settling around them like the warm June air. "The arrangement we made has been good," he said. "It's been more than good. I have my ranch back on its feet, and I'm going to have the money to repay you fully by the end of summer if the beef prices hold as they are. But I don't want to repay you and conclude the arrangement and have that be the end of things between us. I would like it very much if there were a different arrangement, a permanent one." Her heart was doing the unhelpful thing again. She kept her face still and waited, because she wanted to hear him say it. "I would like you to marry me," he said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic, "if you are willing, and if you find the prospect reasonable, which I hope you do, but understand if you don't, because you have built something of your own and I know what it cost you to build it, and I am not asking you to give that up, only to add to it if you want to. I am asking, not assuming. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful hope in his face, at the angular, honest features she had come to know so well over the past 9 months, at the man who had shown up on her porch with his hat in his hands to thank her for something she had done without being asked, and who had, in the course of thanking her, turned out to be entirely unable to leave. And she said, "Orville, yes. Obviously, yes." The expression that moved across his face was not the polished, practiced joy of a man who had rehearsed for good news. It was the raw, simple relief of a man who had not entirely been sure he deserved it, and that quality of it moved her more than any more elaborate response would have. He took her hands in both of his and held them, and there in the June meadow, with the creek running bright beside them and the mountains watching from their permanent distances, he bent his head and kissed her properly for the first time, and it was unhurried and warm and entirely serious, the way everything about him was serious, and she kissed him back with equal conviction. When they told Clara that evening carefully, over supper, with Orville doing most of the explaining, Clara listened with the solemn attention of a child processing significant information, and when he had finished she looked at Letitia with those dark, serious eyes and said, "Will you bring the cinnamon from your kitchen to ours?" "Yes," Letitia said. "Good," Clara said. "Papa always forgets to buy cinnamon." And she went back to her supper with the satisfied expression of a problem neatly solved. They were married in August of 1883, on a Saturday morning, in the church on Main Street that leaned to the east. The ceremony was conducted by Pastor Hale, who was a round and warmly serious man who had been performing marriages and funerals in Dusty Creek for 11 years, and had developed a genuine gift for the former. The boarders attended in their entirety, including Mr. Pratt, who wore his good coat for the occasion, and who wept quietly at the back with the unashamed tears of an old man who felt that the world, on balance, sometimes came good. The Harrises were present with their new baby, born in June, and even Harlan Goss's name was far from anyone's thoughts on that particular morning. Letitia wore her dark green dress, the best one, with the ivory buttons she had ordered from Denver, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Clara had gathered from the meadow at dawn, pressing them into her hands at the church door with an expression of immense responsibility beautifully discharged. Orville stood at the front of the church in a clean dark coat that Letitia strongly suspected was new, his hat held at his side, and when she walked up the aisle toward him and he saw her, the expression that came to his face was so open and unguarded and full of something enormous and uncomplicated that she felt it straight through her chest. They said their vows in plain, clear voices, and when Pastor Hale pronounced them, married Orville kissed her with the same unhurried seriousness he brought to everything, and the assembled company of Dusty Creek produced the kind of approving noise that small frontier communities make when two of their members have done something that feels right and settled and good. The summer ended, and the autumn came in gold and amber, and Letitia moved to the Bristol ranch with her 2 trunks and the milk cow, who was now elderly and dignified and entirely set in her ways, and her strongbox and her china plates and the cedar chest with the good tablecloth, and the boarding house was let to the Harris family, who turned out to have a gift for the work that Letitia felt she had somehow foreseen. The Bristol ranch in autumn was a particular beauty. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and their leaves fell into the water and floated downstream in small bright rafts, and the mountains went purple, and the mornings were cold enough to put frost on the grass, and the kitchen of the ranch house, which Letitia had supplied with cinnamon and many other things besides, smelled of all the warm and domestic pleasures she had long associated with the boarding house, and which felt, now, more personal. She and Orville had settled into a partnership that felt entirely natural. He ran the cattle operation with a steady expertise she admired. She managed the household finances and correspondence with an efficiency he admired in return, and they talked, as they always had, with the ease of people who had learned each other's minds and found nothing there to fear. In October, 1 year after the auction, Orville presented her with the final payment, the last sum that cleared the $480 plus the agreed consideration, in a sealed envelope with his usual precise accounting inside, and she signed the deed over to him at the kitchen table on a quiet afternoon, while the autumn wind worked at the windows, and Clara was outside somewhere with the serious foal, who had indeed turned out to be a working horse of considerable quality. "There," Letitia said, sliding the deed across the table. He picked it up and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression, gratitude and something far beyond it, that made her reach across the table and take his hand. "This is yours," she said. "It was always yours." He turned her hand over in both of his and held it with the careful gravity that was so entirely particular to him. "It's ours," he said, "if you're willing." "I have been willing since June," she said. He smiled, the full, real smile that she had been collecting like pressed flowers since December of the previous year. And it was, she thought, as it always was, entirely worth waiting for. Winter came back to Dusty Creek, and then another spring, and the Bristol ranch grew, not rapidly, not recklessly, but with the steady productive expansion of a well-run operation finding its rhythm. Orville bought 2 more good mares with the spring cattle money. Letitia expanded the kitchen garden to supply not only the household, but a small arrangement with the general store that brought in a modest supplemental income, and which Mr. Pratt, who came to visit on the first Sunday of each month and sat on the front porch and held court with whatever animals Clara dragged into his vicinity, declared to be exactly the kind of practical ingenuity he had come to expect from her. In the spring of 1884, they discovered they were expecting their first child. Letitia told Orville on a May evening on the front porch as the sun went down behind the mountains, speaking plainly and watching his face. And the thing that happened to his face was one of those private human moments she held afterward among the most complete of her life. The wide-eyed rush of it, the careful, overwhelming joy, the way he turned to look at her with something so full and serious and tender in his expression that it had no reasonable vocabulary. He put his arms around her with a gentleness that was characteristic and held her against him, and she felt the steadiness of him, the deep, particular reliability of this man, and was grateful for it in a way that went all the way down. Clara, who was told the following morning at breakfast, took the information with her usual systematic gravity, consumed her entire bowl of porridge in silence, and then announced that she would need a new blue ribbon for her hair for when the baby arrived, because she intended to look her best. When Orville asked whether she would prefer a brother or a sister, Clara considered for a long moment and said, "A brother first, I think. I would like to practice being in charge of someone." The pregnancy was not easy in the midsummer heat, but Letitia was not a woman who was easily deterred by physical discomfort, and she continued managing the household and the garden, and corresponding with the Denver banks and the cattle buyers with an efficiency that she regarded as entirely normal, and which caused the women of Dusty Creek to discuss her with a mixture of admiration and consternation. Mrs. Harris, who had experienced a deeply unpleasant pregnancy the previous year, declared that Letitia Fletcher, she still sometimes called her that, by old habit was constitutionally remarkable. Orville fussed over her in his particular way, which was not the anxious hovering of a man who had forgotten that she was capable, but the steady, attentive care of someone who had thought practically about every possible contingency and addressed them all quietly in advance. There was always water where she needed it, and the heavier outdoor tasks were handled without discussion. And when she was tired in the evenings, he read to her from the newspapers he brought back from the general store, which she found both restful and infuriating, because the newspapers were full of political matters she had opinions about. "You should be running the county," he told her once, looking up from an article about the territorial legislature. "I would do it better than most of the men currently doing it," she agreed. "That is not a boast," he said. "It is simply an accurate observation." She looked at him with the full warmth she rarely distributed carelessly, and he received it with the quiet pleasure of a man who had learned to accept good fortune without suspicion. In November of 1884, on a cold, clear night with stars brilliant above the mountains, their son was born. He was delivered by Mrs. Navarro, whose practical skills in this regard were known throughout the county, and he arrived into the world with a considerable and assertive cry that could be heard from the barn, where Orville was waiting with Clara, because Letitia had instructed him to wait there, and he had complied in the manner of a man who knew that certain battles were not his to fight. When Mrs. Navarro came to the barn door and told him he had a son, the expression on his face was so pure and stunned and grateful that even the horses in their stalls seemed to feel the weight of it. He was a big, vigorous boy with dark hair, and his father's angular features softened, as all Bristol faces apparently were, into a rounder and more approachable version. Clara examined him at length the following morning with the thorough assessment she brought to everything important, and declared him satisfactory, and announced that his name should be Thomas, after her grandfather, and Orville and Letitia looked at each other across the baby's small, determined head, and agreed that Thomas was an excellent name. Thomas Orville Bristol was formally recorded in the county register as born the 12th of November, 1884, and he grew into the name at a rate that satisfied Clara's expectations. The years after Thomas's birth settled into a life that was full rather than frantic, productive rather than merely busy. The ranch continued to grow, Orville's reputation as a cattleman solidified in the county, and the quality of the Bristol horses, the two foals long since become fine working animals, and their breeding program expanding carefully attracted buyers from as far as Denver. Letitia ran the financial side of the operation with the same steady capability she had always brought to her own affairs, and also taught school 3 mornings a week, in a development that had begun when it became apparent that Dusty Creek's single school was perpetually understaffed, and that Letitia's ability to teach arithmetic and reading was considerably better than the current situation warranted. She taught 30 children over those 3 mornings, ranging from 6 to 14, and she was known to be exacting and fair and interesting in a way that small children found impressive rather than frightening. And several of those children grew up and went on to things that Dusty Creek regarded with pride, and some of them always credited when they were asked. A dark-haired woman with brown eyes and a green dress who had taught them that accuracy and honesty were not mutually exclusive, and that the most practical tool a person could carry was a clear mind. Mr. Pratt died in the spring of 1886, quietly in his sleep at the Harrises' boarding house, which he had lived in since Letitia had left it. He left his surveying instruments to Orville, who knew what they were worth, and his books to Letitia, who knew what they were worth, and a letter that said simply that he had not expected his last years to be so entertaining and was grateful to them both. They buried him in the Dusty Creek Cemetery on an April afternoon, with the mountains visible and enormous in the clear spring air, and Letitia stood beside Orville with her hand in his, and felt the ordinary grief of losing someone good and the ordinary gratitude of being surrounded still by people who mattered. In the autumn of 1886 their daughter was born, a small, fierce girl with Letitia's auburn hair and Orville's dark eyes, a combination so striking that even the women who had seen many babies in Dusty Creek stopped to look. Clara, who was now 11 and had been practicing being in charge of Thomas for 2 years with considerable success, received her sister with the satisfaction of a person whose plan had proceeded according to schedule. "She needs a strong name," Clara said, examining the baby with the same solemn thoroughness she had applied to Thomas. "What do you suggest?" Orville asked. "Margaret," Clara said firmly. "It is a serious name for a serious person." Margaret she was. And serious she became, with Letitia's particular quality of quiet determination, and a humor that was entirely her own, dry and unexpected, that began manifesting around age 3 and never really stopped. Orville and Letitia, in the evenings after the children were in bed, sat on the front porch of the ranch house in all seasons, in the cold of winter with wool blankets and hot coffee, and in the warmth of summer with the night air full of cricket noise and the smell of the creek. And they talked about everything as they always had, And the talking never felt like less than the first time because it was based not on novelty but on genuine interest. In each other's thoughts, in each other's observations. In the steady ongoing process of two minds working at the world from similar angles. He was still quiet in crowds and deeply present in small company. She was still direct in a way that caused some people discomfort and other people deep relief. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable competence who, at 14, was already managing the household accounts when Letitia's teaching duties were heavy, and who at 16 announced that she intended to study medicine, which in 1891 in Colorado was not an easy path for a woman but was not an impossible one. And Orville and Letitia listened to this announcement and looked at each other and then looked back at Clara, and Orville said, "Then we will find you the means to do it." And Letitia said, "And I will write you letters of recommendation myself." And Clara looked between them with the expression of a young woman who had expected a more complicated conversation and was pleasantly surprised, and then nodded once as though a matter of business had been concluded. Thomas, who was 7 by this time, announced that he intended to be a horse trainer, and no one was surprised, because Thomas spent a significant portion of every day in the barn talking to horses in a low, patient voice that bore a striking resemblance to his father's, and the horses responded to him with the particular trust that animals extended to people who genuinely understood them. Margaret, at 4, had not yet announced her intentions for her life, but she had opinions about everything else, and the opinions were generally correct. In the spring of 1891, Letitia sat down to reconcile the annual ranch accounts in the proper journal she kept and found, to her satisfaction, that the Bristol operation was not merely solvent but genuinely prosperous, not wealthy in the manner of the large cattle barons, but solidly, sustainably profitable in a way that provided for the family's needs, and then some, and allowed for Clara's future education and Thomas's future endeavors and Margaret's future, whatever it turned out to be. She sat at the kitchen table with the journal and the morning light coming through the window, and felt something that she had not always trusted herself to feel, a clean, unqualified contentment. Not the contentment of someone who had stopped wanting things, but the contentment of someone who had built what they wanted and was living inside it. Orville came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and said, "How does it look?" "Good," she said. "Better than good." He looked at the numbers over her shoulder and nodded once with the satisfaction of a man who had never forgotten what it felt like to face a different kind of arithmetic. Then he sat down and drank his coffee and looked at her across the table with the expression she had been receiving for 7 years, and which had not diminished in the slightest. And she thought about the October morning in 1882, when she had been the only person in Dusty Creek willing to raise a hand, and about the man who had appeared at her door 4 days later with his hat in both hands and a gratitude so genuine, it had rearranged her expectations of what gratitude could look like. "Orville," she said, he said, "do you remember what you said when you came to my door that first time?" He considered. "I said I came to thank you." "Yes," she said. "And then I could not leave," he said, with the simplicity of someone stating an obvious fact. "No," she said, "you could not." He reached across the table and took her hand with the same quiet gravity he had brought to the gesture 8 years ago, and the October light came through the kitchen window and touched the silver in his hair and the lines at the corners of his eyes, and she held his hand with a fullness that required no further words. The Willow Creek pasture would be green again in a few weeks. Thomas had already started planning where to extend the fence line for the expanded breeding program. Clara's acceptance letter from the Women's Medical College in Denver had arrived the previous month and was pinned to the wall above the kitchen shelf. Margaret was somewhere in the yard discovering things with the methodical enthusiasm of a 4-year-old, for whom the entire world was still enormously new. And Orville Bristol was sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the morning light on his face, holding her hand, looking at her with the settled, complete, particular love of a man who had found his place and knew it. Dusty Creek went on being a small town with mountains around it, and a creek running through it, and people doing the ordinary, extraordinary work of living. The church on Main Street still leaned to the east. The saloon was still called the Copper Bit. New families arrived, old ones expanded. The land along Willow Creek ran green, as it mostly did in good years, and the Bristol horses were spoken of favorably in cattle operations across 3 counties. And in town they said that Letitia Bristol, still Letitia Fletcher to some of the older residents, by old habit and in the most affectionate sense, had built 2 good things in Dusty Creek, a boarding house and a life, and both of them had lasted. The autumn of 1882 had been the morning of an auction, and a raised hand, and a woman standing at the back of a crowd with a leather satchel and a quiet determination, and the man who had shown up to thank her, and found that he could not bring himself to leave. And what had grown from that ordinary, extraordinary morning was a family and a home and a love that was not the consuming, theatrical kind, but the daily, constant, deeply rooted kind that holds through drought and difficulty, and all the ordinary emergencies of human life, and keeps holding. In the evenings when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and the mountain stood dark against a sky full of stars, they sat on the front porch and talked or did not talk, and either way it was enough, and more than enough, and everything they had needed. The fire in the stove burned low and orange in the ranch house windows, visible from the road as a warm glow in the dark, a small fixed point of light against the vast and indifferent beauty of the Colorado night, steady and unhurried and entirely, completely home.